Salmon Podcast มันสดอร่อย
In the Name of Work podcast, getting your work to really work with Parit Wacharasindhu.
In collaboration with Rise.
Hello everyone and welcome to In the Name of Work podcast. This is Parit Wacharasindhu, your host, and in this podcast, I will be taking you through a conversation with 8 different guest speakers across 8 very different and exciting areas of work. Hopefully, we'll be able to get to share with you some tips and tricks about how to work more efficiently, how to work more effectively, or how to make your work more fun. Or as we say, how to get your work to really work out for you. In this episode, I'm joined by a very special guest, Mr. Dan Rome. He is a visual thinking expert. He is an author of the best-selling book, The Back of the Napkin, and he is also founder and president of Digital Rome that consults companies across the world on how to structure their thinking visually. Welcome, Dan.
Kun Parit, thank you. It's nice to be here.
Thank you very much for joining us. I think just to shoot off with the first question, can you explain a little bit to us about what visual thinking actually is? Is it just a matter of kind of thinking in shapes, thinking in pictures, or is there more to it than that?
Well, Kun Parit, that's exactly where it begins. There's also more to it than that. When I think about visual thinking, what I mean is intentionally using our entire visual processing system. So what I mean is our eyes, our optic nerve, our visual neocortex, the entire visual processing capacity that we have in our brain, which is giant, to use all of that to help us think more clearly about the world around us, see problems and solutions more clearly. And I really like what you said a moment ago in your introduction, and use the power of our visual mind, pictures and visuals, to make our work more effective, more efficient, and more fun. So part of it is drawing simple shapes. Part of it is being able to understand some of the science of visual processing so that we can really take advantage of the incredible ability that we have as humans to process information visually in order to help us see things that normally would have been invisible and be able to solve problems, sell ideas, and have fun at work in a way that we would never have been able to do with our eyes closed.
So if I think back to a very common day example of when we start to think visually, I think back to when I was a student, and when we try to process new information, one of the kind of the key tricks that you would do as a student is to draw a mind map, right? So whenever you learn a new chapter or a new topic in class, to try and kind of put all your ideas in one place, you would try and draw out like a mind map to structure your ideas. Is that where it all begins? Is that essentially kind of basic version of what you would do as a visual thinker?
Yeah, Kun Parit, that's a really good way to begin. A mind map is one example of using our visual mind to help us think through a really complicated situation. And I really like your example. And I'm delighted to hear that in school you were using mind maps, because it is a way to be able to unpack all of the ideas that are in a book or in our own mind onto a sheet of paper where we can really begin to see the connections. So to answer your question, I would say that is a really good place to start and see the power of visual thinking. And from that basis, let's expand that out to think through how might we use similar types of pictures, whether they're maps or charts, which are visual displays of data, or timelines, which are visual displays of sequences, or flowcharts, which are visual displays of complicated decisions or processes. How we can apply the kind of idea of mind mapping, make it really big, and apply similar types of visual tools to all aspects of learning, thinking, work, and problem solving. So to answer your question, yes, we can start with mind maps, take that same principle and philosophy, and then begin to apply it to everything that we start to think about in the world and in work.
So why is this visual thinking so important in your opinion?
Oh yeah.
Is it a method for capturing and summarizing information? Is it a matter of prioritizing different types of information? Or does actually thinking visually and structuring your thoughts visually actually enable you to solve an actual problem that you would otherwise not solve if you weren't doing it visually?
Well, you've just said the question so well. It's all of those. Yeah. To use the power of our visual mind. So think about this, Parit. Let me put it this way. If you think about your own mind, the human brain, the hundreds of billions of neurons that each one of us has in our brain, and all of the things that we do every day, all the things that we think about, all the things that we experience, the feelings that we have, the situations that we live through, all of those are being processed by our brain, of course. Now, here's what's really interesting. It's estimated by cognitive and neuroscientists that roughly half of all of the processing power that you have in your brain, roughly half of that, in one way or another, is dedicated towards processing visual information. In fact, it turns out that in our brains, more of our brain is dedicated to processing visual images than any other thing that we do. And so what I've been trying to emphasize to my clients and colleagues and business partners for the last many years is think of how much more clearly we will be able to see the world. Think how much more effectively we can capture new ideas. We can prioritize those ideas. And to your question, we can begin to solve problems when we really intentionally take advantage of this incredible visual processing that we have in our brain that normally we don't think about at all. And so that really is the basis of all of my work and all of my books, is being thoughtful and intentional about taking advantage of what our brain wants to do anyway that we never think about.
Can you share with us kind of one example, one real life example, just so that the audience can get a clearer picture of what you mean by using visual thinking to solve a problem? It could be like a personal example, could be a business example.
Certainly, Kumpara. Yes. So as you mentioned in the introduction, I've had a chance to consult with a number of organizations around the world. And when I do that consulting, typically what will happen is someone in the business will say, we have this really complicated situation or this really complicated problem. Is there some way that we can help work through it more effectively and efficiently than we have in the past? And let me give you an example. So several years ago, two gentlemen I'm in the United States. I'm here in San Francisco. So I'm going to tell you beginning a story that took place here in the United States. Two guys were sitting in a bar, and there was a napkin on the bar between them, and they were probably having some beer. And these were two very seasoned senior business executives. And they were thinking about starting an airline. And one of them took a pen, and on that napkin on the bar, he drew 3 dots in the form of a kind of a triangle. Imagine 3 dots that represent 3 major cities in Texas, in the United States. And Texas is a huge state in the United States, and there are 3 major cities: Dallas and Houston, and a city called San Antonio. And they're all very, very far apart. I mean, Texas is an enormous state. It could take 3 to 4 to 5 hours to drive from one of those cities to the next. And those 3 cities represent the 3 major business hubs of Texas. So the 2 guys are sitting there at the bar, and they take the pen and they draw the 3 dots, and then they connect them in a very simple triangle and say, why hasn't anyone ever made an airline that just connects these 3 cities? What a genius idea that would be. And that was the beginning. That little drawing, a triangle connecting these 3 dots, was the original beginning of what has ended up becoming the most successful airline in American history. An airline called Southwest Airlines was literally started with a simple drawing on the back of a napkin. So that's one example, not from my own experience, but kind of in the great fables of businesses that have started with a drawing. And Kun Parit, as I've done this work over these last many years, every time I go into a new business, someone will say to me, oh my gosh, you're right. So many of our businesses or our companies were started with a simple drawing like that. And I can give you another example. It's a great story. If I can share one more, there's a very big software company, and I know that your listeners in Thailand are familiar with this company, many of them. The company is called Salesforce, and it is the largest provider of cloud-based CRM, customer relationship management software in the world. They're headquartered here in San Francisco. And the reason that I suspect many of your listeners in Thailand might be familiar with Salesforce is Salesforce has done a very, very good job of, in particular in the Thai financial services industry, a lot of Thai banks use Salesforce for customer relationship management and cloud-based business services. So there's a lot of familiarity there. But the story I like to share is that literally the founder and CEO of Salesforce, a gentleman named Mark Benioff, was meeting with the CEO of a large fashion company. You may have heard of the London-based fashion company Burberry. Burberry has been known for over 100 years for making the most fashion-oriented trench coats, outerwear, scarves. Everybody's familiar with this very famous Burberry plaid. Now, the reason I tell you this story is Mark Benioff, who's the founder and CEO of this huge software company, is sitting down at the table with a woman named Angela Ahrendts, who was the CEO of Burberry Fashion Company. And the two of them were trying to think through, technically, how might it be possible to help Burberry become a more social media, internet-based fashion leader? Because traditionally it had been a very conservative organization, not a lot of technology in the past. And they took a piece of paper and the two of them simply started drawing. And Kun Parit, to your question, some circles. And the first circle was, let's say, this is the customer of Burberry. And then another circle over here that says, what kind of data are we able to collect about that customer? And then another circle over here, just like a mind map. What can we do with that data to help improve our fashion trends? And the two of them together, these two very, very wealthy, very, very powerful senior executives sitting there with this piece of paper, ended up drawing this incredible diagram that became literally the technical architecture for the new version, the new online forward version of Burberry, which was incredibly successful for the company. And both of those CEOs credited later the clarity of their conversation came down to the fact that they were both drawing the picture, and therefore they could see exactly what the other one meant. So, Kun Parit, those are just two stories. I have many, many more, but what do you think of those? Do those help clarify for you a little bit of what you're asking?
Yeah, that helps clarify a little bit. I was actually drawing the picture as you were speaking as well to get a better sense.
That's exactly what I do as well. And I have a big whiteboard behind me here in the office. And every time I'm on a video call now, and let's face it, we all live in this world of remote meetings, Zoom meetings, GoToWebinar, Google Hangouts, etc. What I'll do is to help clarify even any conversation is I wheel out this whiteboard that I have and just start drawing on it. And it's amazing the clarity that you can achieve with someone when you can look at the same idea together, these simple shapes and arrows and lines, and then react to each other. It becomes a very dynamic conversation and one which is very, very, I would say, very human and very authentic. And when you have that conversation, whether it's in a sale or a strategy session or a business planning session, the fact that you're sharing your ideas so quickly is really, really beneficial and powerful and makes it very human.
So I think just to elaborate on that point, right? I think so for people who are already kind of have the base of or people already thinking visually might see the value in terms of drawing it out and then kind of structuring their thoughts in a visual way. But what about, I mean, I understand that there are some people in the world who don't actually think visually. So they might think in terms of sounds, or when they learn new things, they learn better from audio rather than kind of seeing a picture, an image. Does visual thinking also help those people, or is it only for the people who are kind of better or more used to thinking visually? Essentially, is visual thinking for everyone?
Yes, and what an incredible question. And I have an easy answer for you. And the answer is absolutely, it helps everyone, because everyone to some degree or another does think visually. Certainly anyone who has the sense of sight, anyone at all, we know how powerful vision is to us. Just think about this, Kun Parit. You wake up in the morning and the first thing you do is, you open your eyes and you look outside and you see is it dark out or is it light out? And that helps you determine, is it time for me to get up or not? And then you look outside and you see, what is the weather? And that helps you determine, am I going to wear warmer clothes today or am I going to wear cooler clothes today? And then you get out of your bed and you make your way, through to the kitchen or through the hallway. All of that time, your visual engine is guiding you. There's nobody telling you. There's no voice in your head that's saying, put your left foot in front of your right foot, walk 3 steps, turn right, go through the door, turn 90 degrees, turn to the kitchen. The reason I bring this up is because although some people skew more, to your point, towards being more auditory in their preference for learning information, which is true, and some people are more visual in their preference for learning information, to me, the baseline is that all of us are vastly visual to begin with. Now, of course, in my years of experience and travel to different countries and different businesses, of course, you're absolutely right. Some people by nature would much prefer to learn information by having it written for them or having it spoken to them sort of in bullet points, 1, 2, 3, 4. Many people do. But what I have found is that no matter what someone's preference is, the moment that you start to visualize what we're hearing, it becomes clearer for everyone. So I'm not going to say to people, everybody must draw more pictures. Nope, I would never say that. But what I would say is for most of us, even those who are very auditory or very verbal, something really powerful happens when we need to communicate our idea to someone else, when we try to draw a very, very simple picture of it. And Kun Parit, may I tell you one more story? It'll just take me a moment about a personal experience that I had.
Sure, go for it.
So one of the things that's really interesting for me, I love to come to Thailand. I love to come to Krung Thep. And the reason for that is many years ago when I was a student in the United States, I was selected to become an exchange student through a program called AFS. You might be familiar with this. I don't know. So I was selected to become an exchange student to go to Bangkok for a year. So I was 17 years old. This was many, many years ago. And so I left my home in Montana in the United States, and I got on a plane and I flew 18 hours along with a set of colleagues, other exchange students from the United States, and we arrived in Krung Thep, and I didn't speak a word of Thai. I'd never been to Thailand. At that time, I had a very difficult time even knowing on a map where you would find Thailand. So I had no experience whatsoever. And I ended up staying in Nonthaburi, in a little town called Bang Buatong, north Nonthaburi, and I lived with a Thai family for that year. And no one in that family really spoke English, and I didn't speak any Thai. So for the first couple of months, eventually I learned to speak Thai reasonably well, as you could, in a year of very intensive exchange program, living with the family. This was before the internet, of course. The family I lived with didn't even have a telephone in those days. So we spent hours and hours over weeks and weeks and months sitting around the kitchen table or sometimes sitting on the floor and take out a sheet of paper and just start drawing and talking. And I'd be speaking English. And of course, my Thai family would be speaking Thai. But on that piece of paper, imagine with me, Kun Parit, I would say something like this. My family has 5 people. And the family I would be talking about my American family, and my Thai family wouldn't know what I was saying because they didn't speak English. But then on the piece of paper, I would draw 5 circles, and I would add a little bit of hair to each of those circles. And then I would draw an arrow towards the first one, and I would say, this circle is my father. This is Kun Pa. And this circle is my mother. This is Kun Ma. And then this is my older brother, and this is my next brother, and this is me. And we would have conversations for hours where we were passing the pen back and forth, drawing maps, drawing pictures of our houses, our families. And it was the most incredible experience. And it, Kun Parit, is what really began to share with me that the true common language of all people is pictures. Because you could speak Thai, you could speak English, you could speak German, you could speak Chinese. and you wouldn't be able to talk to each other. But one thing, and this has been so true throughout my life, is one language all of us have in common is the language of drawing a simple picture, a couple of circles, a couple of squares, a couple of arrows. And what I've tried to do through my whole life is sometimes I have lived in other countries where I didn't speak the language. And of course, for that reason, the drawing is very, very important. But most of my life has lived in the United States, where obviously I speak the same language as my colleagues. But here's the thing that I find interesting. You go into different businesses and different industries. Say, for example, you go into the financial services industry, and there's a very specific language that is spoken there, the language of financial services, where people talk about profit and loss, or they talk about margin, or they talk about any type of quantitative information around finances. And then maybe a week later, you go into the healthcare industry, and people there talk about healthcare metrics, or they talk about diseases, or they talk about oncology or cancer, a very different language they're speaking. Here's the point I want to make. In any one of these different industrial languages, the pictures are still universal. And I find this absolutely powerful. And this is why I've been able to be successful. And so many of my colleagues have been successful, because those of us that speak the language of pictures very well find that we can move between different industries, different jobs, different careers very easily, because again, it comes back to that common language. So, Kun Parit, thank you for letting me answer your short question with a very, very long answer. But I believe the power of being able to communicate your idea through visuals and simple pictures is extraordinarily powerful, even if you are primarily a verbal person.
I see. So I think from your examples you just shared with us, I think we can see more clearly about how visual thinking can solve some of the problems, right? It can help you better kind of plan your airplane or airline routes. It can help you overcome the language barrier when you're in a foreign country. Kind of going a bit deeper into kind of examples from the business world. I know you've worked with businesses across many different sectors. The question that comes to my mind is, how complex a problem can visual thinking solve, right? So can it solve kind of primarily, so the example of kind of airplane routes, for example, is a problem which I think we can all see that it can be solved kind of visually, because it's very much to do with kind of laying out the map, seeing kind of the origin, the destination of all the possible routes. Mm-hmm. But kind of for other kind of more complex, potentially word-based problems, right? So problems related to, let's say, profit and loss in the finance industry, or problems that are not necessarily you would associate automatically with it being solved visually. Mm-hmm. How do you turn those kind of problems into something more visual and solve them? Can you share with us some examples of the problems that you solve for your clients using this visual thinking technique?
Oh, absolutely. What an incredible question. And thank you for letting me share some thoughts on that. I typically find myself more often dealing with issues of strategy than probably any other single type of business issue. And here's what I find quite fascinating. As all of us who've ever been through any kind of business training know, it's very important for an organization, whether it's a business or a nonprofit or even a governmental organization, to have a sense of underlying vision. Meaning, what is the vision of our organization? What mission are we trying to serve? What change are we trying to bring about in the world? And I find it really fascinating that the word, at least in English, that's used to describe an organization's highest sense of purpose is the word vision. Isn't that funny that we use the word vision to describe our sense of purpose? Because again, strategy, we might frame it as a word problem. And you used the example a moment ago of something in financial services being a profit and loss problem, and let's talk our way through it. That's great. But if you actually work in financial services, you know that 90% of the work is done using charts, which are visual displays of number. And we have a tendency to talk about those charts a lot, but what we're really doing is we're looking at them. And so I find that you can kind of break almost all problems in the world that any organization or even individual is going to face into one of 6 fundamental types of problems. And what I mean by that is sometimes we have problems of quantity, which is typical where we are in financial services, meaning we don't have enough money or we don't have enough time. So when we face a problem of quantity, which is typically what you find in financial services, the pictures that you would want to draw are going to be charts. What is a chart? It's a visual display of number. What is our profitability? You can picture a chart. Last year, our profit was, let's say, 15%. This year, our profit is only 11%. Now, you can already see that in your mind that there's a trend line going down. So if we project that forward from 15% last year to 11% this year, well, what might it be next year? If we continue that trend line down, we're trending down, maybe we'll only be at 8%. So the point I'm making is that's still a picture. And as we look at that chart, we can see that trend and say, okay, so what should we do to bend that back up? Now, there's a separate type of problem, which might be a problem of location, meaning we have several factories in several countries, but let's say our customers are in other countries. So now we have a challenge of location. What picture would we draw to try to clarify that problem? Well, now we're not going to draw a chart anymore. Now we're actually going to draw a map, like we did with the airline. We'd say, here's where our factories are actually located, but here's where our customers are located. And we would notice in our map, they're not in the same place. So then here's the beauty of using visuals to solve the problem. Now that you've mapped out the problem as factories are far removed from customers, the picture lends itself towards a couple of solutions. Well, one would be, should I move the factory to be closer to my customer? That's a possibility. That is, on a map, becomes a potential solution. Another one is, could I move my customer closer to my factory? Well, that's going to be really hard. I don't have control over my customer normally. But what else could I do on this map? Well, I could increase the frequency of supply chain connections between these countries and these customers and sort of solve the geographic problem through more effective logistics. The point I'm trying to make is for any type of problem that we can conceptualize with words, I believe there is a visual alternative that we can also craft, which it might not be better than the verbal description of the problem, but it's always going to give us another way of looking at that problem. And often that new way, by creating a pictorial representation of the problem, will also often give us an insight that would not have been discovered if we just continued to talk about it. Now, because I sound perhaps a little bit like a broken record, draw pictures, draw pictures, draw pictures, I think it's important that I clarify a little bit. I am a writer. I have written hundreds and hundreds of thousands of words, and I've written many word problems and word solutions, and I love it. I love to tell stories. I love to sit around as we're doing right now and just kind of talk things through. But what you cannot see is what helps me do that is all of the time that we are talking, I'm actually drawing on a piece of paper to collect my thoughts and clarify them, or I'm drawing on a whiteboard, or sometimes I'm just literally drawing shapes in the air as I'm talking to move from this point to this point. So, other examples, financial services, a picture often is what you need to look at to determine what is the right financial strategy to put in place to move those trends in the line that we want. Strategy, business strategy, tends to bring about pictures of two types. The first type is that kind of map that we talked about that says strategically, our business is located over here in this kind of market segment. And strategically, in order to continue to grow, we need to move to a different market segment. Well, that's a map. How might we clarify our strategy? By literally drawing it on a coordinate system and seeing where might we make the best moves. That's one type of picture for strategy. Another type of picture for strategy is after we've decided where we want to go, the next question is, what steps do we need to take strategically to get there? Meaning, what is the first thing we need to do, and then the second thing, and the third thing, and so on. And that lends itself to a third type of picture. We're going to call it the timeline or the sequence map, which is, as you can imagine, maybe starting over on the left, moving from left to right. What is the sequence of steps that we might want to go through to realize this strategy that we've articulated? So, Kun Parit, again, thank you for letting me go on at length. I hope my enthusiasm and passion is helping to clarify even further. How are my answers sitting with you? Is this making sense, or do I sound like a crazy man?
No, you don't. You don't sound like a crazy man. Actually, when you were going through the different kind of the different ways to visualize a business strategy, right? Starting from how you segment your market, kind of going on to how you could potentially switch your segments, and therefore ending up with a timeline of what you need to do when to get there. This all sounds very similar to the thinking process I do when I make, let's say, like a PowerPoint presentation, right? Thinking about how to kind of visualize kind of different stages or different messages that I'm trying to communicate. Is it related? Are these two fields kind of related? Kind of how we think visually, and then how we then kind of turn that into a presentation, which we then present to clients, to business partners?
Oh, such a great question. Yes. And in fact, I'm working on a sixth book right now. Kun Parit, I'm happy to tell you, I've just received the contract for my next book. And the next book is going to be about exactly the topic you just brought up, the shift from visual thinking to visual storytelling. I'm pretty sure this is common. Among business people that I talk to around the world, there's an enormous trend the last 2 years or so, whether it's in sales or strategic management or training, really problem solving, to be able to tell a good story. Because we all know that business is really complicated, strategies are complicated, market activity is really complicated, the things that we're trying to solve, the things that we're trying to sell, they're complicated. And by the way, everybody's life that we're trying to talk to is also really complicated. Everybody's so busy these days. The best way to convey an idea seems to be by just telling a story. So to your question, when you're working on a PowerPoint, and I'm so happy you said that because I do the same thing, I will draw the kind of pictures we talked about a moment ago as just the thinking process. But now when I need to share it with someone else, it's going to shift from visual thinking to visual storytelling. And that's where PowerPoint comes in, because you're going to take your slide, or some people use Google Documents, or whatever the mechanism is. What you need to do is convert these very lovely visual ideas you have into something that someone else can understand in kind of a linear fashion. And so what you do is you take those 6 pictures we were drawing a moment ago. Some of them are pictures about numbers. Some of them are pictures about segmentation or location. Some of them are pictures about sequence or timing. And you convert them into a seamless visual story that then becomes the pages of your PowerPoint. And what's really beautiful about this visual storytelling approach is if you've been effective in kind of unpacking the complexity of your thinking into these pictures, you now have really beautiful starting point for the building blocks of the story that you want to tell. So for example, I could even play one out with you right now, Kun Parit, just for a second. Imagine that I wanted to, well, I have an idea. So I'm working on this new book, and it is a book about visual storytelling. I could tell you a visual story about visual storytelling, and it might go in my PowerPoint something like this. I might say, okay, Kun Parit, you and I both have the same challenge. We need to convey a complex idea to a very distracted audience. And in particular, these days, through a remote meeting, a Zoom or a GoToMeeting. We can't even be in the same room as most of the people we want to talk to. So that's a problem that we have. That's slide number 1. Slide number 2 is I then say, so how might we improve that problem? Well, what things can we bring that help clarify complexity in a way which is engaging and efficient and kind of fun? Well, that would be slide 2. What could we do? Slide 3 might be, hey, we could draw more pictures. Drawing these pictures would help clarify the complexity and make the presentation more engaging. So now we've gotten 3 slides done. The 4th slide would be, okay, so what pictures would we draw? And that's where I might share with you, well, Kun Parit, I think there's 6 types of pictures we could draw, each one of which has a role in helping tell the story. And then our final slide would be, so which picture are we going to start with? So now what we've done is we've actually told a visual story about the subject, and it's become a beautiful 6-page PowerPoint that we could share with anyone else, and they would understand, they would be able to follow along the story with us. So I've gone on again. How does that sit with you? Can you kind of see in your mind's eye what I'm describing?
Yes. So I think we can see now some examples of how we can use pictures to either kind of summarize information, structure them in a better way, and then better communicate or tell a story about the point we're trying to make. I think one area that I just want to get kind of slightly clearer example for our audiences is, so apart from being able to summarize information, how can you use kind of pictures to find new solutions to a problem, right? So for example, can you share with us like a concrete example or a project you did with a client where the client was like found it very difficult. They had a problem that they couldn't solve. They had a problem that they couldn't find a solution to. And then once you kind of coach them to think visually, to map out their ideas visually, then they found a solution that they otherwise would not have found had they not gone through that process.
Oh,
do you have an example you can share on that?
Oh, absolutely. So I have many. And in fact, let me just pick kind of one that would be able to convey through words most effectively.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's going to be a challenge.
Yeah. So I was working recently with a large healthcare organization. Now, healthcare around the world, each country has its own setup. Here in the United States, we don't really have what we would call integrated healthcare, meaning that typically the hospital where you receive your care is one part of the healthcare system, and then another part of the healthcare system is actually the insurance company that's going to pay for it. So typically when in the United States you go to a hospital, you go in, they operate on you or they do the treatment, what have you, and then the billing is sent through your insurance company, and then the insurance company comes around the back and bills you later on, and then after that you go and you get any government assistance that may have been available. And I have to tell you, the process is extraordinarily complicated. And so I was working with a healthcare provider that was trying to imagine, how can we make the system more seamless for our customers? And for a healthcare organization, in this case, a large hospital, the customer has a different name. We call them a patient. So this is the person who's the customer of healthcare, is someone who's sick, and the product that they're actually purchasing is their health. So if you can think about it that way, now you could draw a picture that says, over here we have the hospital, and over here we have the customer. The customer is coming to the hospital and they're receiving the product, which is better health. That might be a surgery or an operation or an outpatient clinic or what have you. But then the payment part of it is way over here on a separate side of our whiteboard, completely disconnected. So no wonder the process is very complicated. What would happen as we look at this picture? How might we bring the payment system and the healthcare delivery system into the same world? So what would happen now? You can imagine this map where we have these disconnected pieces, all of which is very, very confusing to the patient, who, by the way, the patient is also ill. So the last thing they want to do is go through all of this crazy complexity of going one place to have their healthcare and going to another place to try to take care of paying for it. So on our map, what we said is, what would happen if you actually brought the payment system into the hospital and actually treated the hospital more like a retail store? What would that mean? Well, what that would mean is you'd have much more transparency and clarity around the price of care, which might help to make the care more efficient. Because if you separate the delivery of care way over on, say, the left side of our whiteboard, From payment for care, which is way over on the right side of our whiteboard, there's no payment transparency between them. So the customer doesn't actually know what they're paying, which is why, in a large degree, healthcare costs in the United States have risen at an unsustainable rate because there's a separation of payment from actually delivery. So the picture that we drew, see if this makes sense, Kun Parit, in the case of this large hospital, in order to drive greater cost efficiency, why don't we charge the patient at the time of care, and in the same way that that patient, if they went to a restaurant, would be able to choose what they were going to buy according to their budget, or they went into a store and were able to choose what product they were going to buy. Let's make it completely clear to the patient what healthcare products are going to be delivered to them based on what they need, and then work through with them how the pricing works. And what we were able to find is you get vastly more efficient and transparent pricing structures, which actually drives the cost of healthcare down at the same time that it is improving healthcare outcomes. So that's one complicated example where if you had just tried to solve that problem by looking at spreadsheets and a report, you would never have seen the possibility of improving the clarification simply by moving these two disparate parts, payment and delivery, into the same. And now, what's interesting is the most successful in terms of healthcare outcomes and financial stability, the most successful healthcare organizations in the United States are those that have integrated the payment with care delivery. Does that make sense, what I've described? Can you kind of see how that works?
Yes, I can see that very clearly. And I'm actually trying to think ahead now about if there is actually any business problem that cannot be solved visually, right? So, for example, we talked about how we can lay out our business strategy more clearly using pictures. I think you've just shown us how we can improve like a certain process or a customer experience by mapping them out in kind of as a picture. I'm trying to now think about if there are any business problems that we cannot actually solve visually, right?
Well, Kun Parit, if I might, maybe let's reframe the thought just a little bit, because let's just be upfront. There are business and organizational problems that probably cannot be solved at all. There are, and we often refer to these as wicked problems. So the difference between, say, a wicked problem and a traditional problem is something like flying, let's take our airline example. Flying an airplane from point A to point B to point C and maximizing customer revenue per air mile, that is a solvable problem. That you can do that. It's math. It's math and a map. You can solve it. But something like, again, just from a healthcare perspective, here in the United States, the incidence of diabetes is going up radically. That's not really a solvable problem. That's a wicked problem because there are so many contributing factors to that. Such things as poor dietary habits, which can lead to obesity, which can lead to poor health, which can lead to diabetes. And you can't just solve it by saying everybody eat better. It's a really complicated problem. But what you can do, you can't solve diabetes, but what you can do with our pictures is you can at least clarify the underlying reasons why this problem is growing. And you could do that in a written report, certainly, that would have, many, many data points behind it. But I still believe you could clarify that written report so that it could be more readily understood and perhaps even more valuable by creating a series of visual maps that explain all of the elements that are contributing. So what I wanted to do in reframing this is say, there are problems that are ahead of us that are not solvable. I think, for example, some of the global economic challenges that are faced right now by say COVID that's in front of us. I don't know that we're ever going to solve that because we will be able to fix certain parts of the problem, but just given how complex the world is, it's probably very likely that the kinds of problems that are coming around by COVID are just going to become increasingly, we're going to have to develop new systems for thinking about dealing with global health. We're not going to solve it, but we'll make little fixes along the way. If a problem can be solved, a picture can help solve it. I believe that's true 100% of the time. If the problem is not solvable because it's too big or too complicated, I believe that the role of a picture is to help us at least understand what the pieces are so we can do the best job we can to fix those pieces that are fixable. Does that help clarify a little bit?
Yep. So I think if I understand you correctly, I think what you're saying is that it's not the case that a picture can solve everything, right? But at least it can lay out the potential solutions and enable you to see solutions that you might otherwise not see if you don't draw it out.
Yeah, that's well said. Thank you. That's better. You said it better than I did. Yes, thank you.
Do you see this technique as something which should substitute other techniques of solving a problem, or do you see it as complementary? So, for example, if a certain company, certain set of business leaders are so used to solving problems without kind of visual thinking, but solving through math only, solving through kind of listing out the problems in bullet points and brainstorming solutions in that way, do you see this as something that should replace that, or do you see this as something which should go hand in hand with what they're already used to?
Oh, great question. Absolutely complementary. I'm not advocating that we replace any type of problem solving or clarification tool that we have. It's not a matter of competing models. It's a matter of trying to do the best we can and bring to bear every resource we have. And I think the reason that I'm so passionate about emphasizing the visual is because of all sort of training and teaching and thinking modalities. It's the one that has been the least supported through kind of traditional education over the last 100 years or so. And that sounds ironic, but the data are pretty clear. I can't speak to education in Thailand because I just don't know it well enough. I did spend my 1 year at Mosoha at Rongren Ratana Tibet อยู่จังหวัดนนทบุรีนะครับ. So I have 1 year of experience many years ago of the Thai educational system, but I don't really know much about it. But here in the United States, we've moved increasingly in the last couple of decades towards a testing-based educational system, which I don't think is a good idea, because what it means is you're training students to learn the right answer instead of teaching students how to think. And there's a difference there between the right answer, because the big problems we face today do not have a right answer. They have typically, from many, many contributing complex elements. What I believe is the key element of education is to teach us not what to think, but to give us tools to help us in how to think. And so in that regard, of course, spoken language is baseline, absolutely critical. And I think we should amplify the amount of education we do around really effective verbal thinking and public speaking. I think that's important. But from a complementary perspective, to answer specifically your question, I absolutely believe that we would all benefit from applying more emphasis to simply understanding how do people process visual information, and how come we're so good in our day-to-day life at making good decisions based simply on what we see, and what are the lessons there that we could apply in a more formal educational system. So to answer your question, a complement, as many tools as we can bring to bear, the more that we have that we understand, the better off we're going to be.
โปรโมชั่นพิเศษสำหรับคุณผู้ฟัง In the Name of Work Podcast ถ้าสนใจคอนเทนต์จากสปีกเกอร์ระดับโลกแบบนี้อีกสามารถใช้โค้ด Salmon SALMON เพื่อเป็นส่วนลด 10% เข้าชมงาน Corporate Innovation Summit หรือ CIS ปี 2020 Event Virtual Experiential Conference ที่จะจัดขึ้นในวันที่ 15-17 กันยายนนี้เ ปิดขายบัตรแล้ววันนี้ทางเว็บไซต์ cis.writeexcel.com ย้ำนะครับ cis.riseaccel.com แล้วเจอกันครับ
So do we, if we kind of get someone who's not used to this kind of technique of thinking visually, to start to think visually and to use that, as you mentioned, as an additional tool for solving a problem, do we run the risk of ever kind of overcomplicating the problem? So for example, if someone is trying to force fit a certain visual or a certain picture into a problem that they're trying to solve, do we run the risk of it kind of being a little bit too forced, or are there ways we can kind of prevent ourselves from doing that?
Gosh, what a fantastic question. And it kind of goes two directions, doesn't it, Kun Parit? Because on the one hand, by forcing a new tool, we might overcomplicate the solution approach. And on the other hand, it is also something to be cognizant of. Sometimes by forcing a simple picture into a complicated problem, let's be honest, we can actually make the problem worse if we draw a picture that misrepresents the underlying data or the underlying architecture of the problem. So, but this is true of all learning modalities. So I'm not worried about the idea of making problem solving more complex by bringing in a new tool set. As long as that tool set is understood, it's well clarified, it's well tested, and it works in complement to tool sets we already have, then it should not overcomplicate something. In fact, what it should do, this new visual thinking tool set, what it should do, if nothing else, is serve as a kind of a fact check, an alternative point of view on a more traditional method of problem solving. So before we commit to one course of action, this is always a good idea. I don't know how you would say this in Thai, but there's an old sort of English axiom that comes from the construction trade. So someone who builds furniture or builds houses, anybody who ever works with tools, you measure something twice and then you cut it once, because you only get to cut the material one time, but you can measure it a couple of times. So what I'm thinking here is, as we make a decision to take a course of action to help solve a problem, we really want to make sure that we're taking the best decision we can. So why don't we think it through from a verbal perspective and come up with an answer, and then think it through from a visual perspective and validate that we come up with the same answer. And if we come up with a different answer, then let's go back and reframe the problem to see why are we coming up with two different approaches? And I don't think that overcomplicates anything. I think that if we are thoughtful about it, it should actually give us a greater sense of comfort that we have really thought the problem through as best as we can. We've given it our full attention, both verbal and visual. If the two align and we come up with an answer, we're very certain that that is a good approach to go, because we've really run it through the full capability of our thinking process. I'm not sure that answers your question, but I think it sounds kind of right to me.
Yeah, so it's a method of kind of checking your answers, right? Seeing if different approaches lead you to the same recommended decision.
Right.
How related is all this to the field of data analytics and data visualization? Because I think currently kind of businesses will have loads and loads of data, right, that they can use to analyze. And I think being able to know which type of data to analyze, how to visualize the patterns that we're seeing, can sometimes be quite helpful in terms of driving at a certain conclusion to a certain problem, right? So do you see this as being related to the fields of data visualization as well?
Absolutely. In fact, they're two sides of the same coin. Visual thinking is in my mind, is really the intentional use of all of our visual power to try to help us clarify whatever it is that we're looking at. That is the one side of the coin. The other side is, to your point, you're absolutely right. Your questions are fantastic. Given the amount of data that are being collected today by any business, by the robots, by online, all of that data. We've never had this kind of data available to us before, but we still face the fundamental problem of what do we look at? What data is valuable to us? And then the deeper problem of once we've identified which types of data are meaningful, how do they actually intersect? Because typically in the old world, the old days, we would all boot up Microsoft Excel, and let's say we're talking in any sort of quantitative data set. Let's just take a very simple, say, stock price. We have two pieces of data. We have time and we have value. And we can make a very simple XY plot where our x-axis is time and our y-axis is price, and we'll get a stock ticker, and we'll be able to look at that and we'll see it going up and down. That is such a simple data set, though, because imagine if we were able to now, and we can with the data we collect and the beginning of artificial intelligence, we can start to layer in there other dimensions of data, such as time of day, temperature, customer response time, customer location, product selection, product color, all of these things that in the past we would be forced to just work with maybe 2 different dimensions of data. Now we can have 20 dimensions of data, all of which are intersecting. And this is where true AI-driven data visualization comes in. And this is also a passion of mine because it, in the end, is going to use exactly the same tools we've been thinking about. In fact, some of my favorite examples are where in working through a business strategy, we've been able to take 5, 6, 7 different dimensions of data that typically would have been analyzed independently. And by using really clever and thoughtful mapping, even before artificial intelligence or really complicated systems like Tableau or some of the other great data visualization business analytics tools, just with pen and paper, a whiteboard, try to think through how would I map together 4, 5, 6 different dimensions of data? And if I could see them in parallel, what would that tell me? What would that show me that just looking at them independently I never would have seen? This is where really incredible breakthroughs are coming in. So again, forgive me for my long answer, but you've hit a point that's of real passion to me. Yes, Parit, the answer is data visualization, to me, is an element of visual thinking and visual processing, and it's a very specific element of it, and it's one that is critically important and will become even more difficult as we get more and more data, which is why, again, tools like, are you familiar with a tool called Tableau? Is that something?
Yes.
So Tableau, which now, by the way, is owned by Salesforce. Salesforce went and bought it a year ago. Why? Because Salesforce, we were talking earlier, giant company in the cloud collecting massive amounts of customer information, saw a need for that data to be displayed meaningfully to their customers so people could make good decisions about it. And so they bought Tableau as a very effective tool to help doing that. Now, there are many other types of tools as well, but that's just one that I'm familiar with. And what's beautiful about Tableau or other types of data visualization tools, and think about where all these things we are talking about, Parit, they intersect. From one of those data visualization tools, you have the ability to generate a geographic map. So that map might show you sales and price data based on geography. Well, that's the map we were talking about before. That's a where picture. You might also be able to create a time series. Well, that's the timeline we were talking about before. What I find so beautiful about this is once we get into pictorial information, all of these things we're talking about, they intersect in an almost beautiful way because they all give us the power to then look at this new chart or table or map or data visualization and suddenly see insights there that in the old world of a written report and bullet points, to be fair, We're completely invisible.
I'm sure members of our audience can really relate to that. I mean, spending minutes and hours staring at an Excel, right? You can't really see what the numbers are telling us until you actually start drawing it out and turning them into kind of charts or 3D graphs, right? So I think that's a very powerful way to illustrate why visual thinking is so important, right? And I think we spent a lot today talking about the why, as in like why visual thinking is so important as a tool for solving a problem. I want to move a little bit to the how. So how does one become better at thinking visually? What kind of skill sets would they need to kind of develop? How early on in their life do they need to develop these skill sets? Any advice you have on how to become a better visual thinker?
Yeah, actually, and I think there's probably 2 or 3 parallel paths that one could take. And the first one, obviously, well, I hope it's obvious, is we should all become a little bit more comfortable and confident in our ability to just draw basic pictures. And that sounds a little bit childish, and that's just how it is. And think about this. Every one of us knows that as a child, before we could learn to read and write, the first few years in school, even at home before going to school, we drew all the time. I mean, if you take a pencil or a crayon and you put it in the hand of a child and you give them a sheet of paper, or sometimes they don't even need paper, they'll draw on the wall. As humans, we have this innate desire to try to make marks, to represent what we think and what we see. And early on, those are just in the forms of drawings. And, you know, we were all children at one time, and we all drew terrible little stick figures and little houses and cars or whatever or birds, whatever we enjoyed. But then sometime, usually about the time we hit age 7 or 8, 9, about the time we really start to read more, unfortunately, we're told, you don't need to do those drawings anymore. You were never any good at the drawing anyway, so let's forget about that and let's just activate our verbal mind. And for most of us, that's the way we go all the way through high school, college, post-secondary, postgraduate work. Write your dissertation, write your report. Step number 1 is let's just take a little bit of time to practice and become comfortable in the idea of just simple drawing, because it's a really, really powerful tool. That's path number 1. Path number 2 is learn a little bit about what I call the frameworks of visual thinking. And again, it's basically there are really only 6 types of pictures that we're ever going to draw. And I can share those with you now. We've talked about them, but I can give you the full list right now. We can draw simple emojis or icons that represent the things that we're talking about. So we can draw stick figures or boxes or what have you, little emojis, a smiley face. That's one type of drawing, and it represents a physical object we're talking about. Then we can draw a map. We've talked about those. We can draw a timeline. We've talked about those. We can draw a chart, which again, back to our conversation about Tableau, which is really think about it as a data visualization, a picture that represents number. That's another picture we can draw. The 5th type of picture we could draw is a flow chart. And this is where things start to get a little more complicated because a flow chart really combines everything we've seen up to this point. In a flow chart, if you think about what's there, you have a box. Well, that's an icon, and that box might represent, say, a database, or that box might represent, or a triangle might represent a decision point. So we've got our kind of icons. Then we connect them with lines. We're added in a timeline function. Then we might add quantities into that. How big are each of those shapes? We're adding those in. So the 5th type of picture is our flow chart that pulls together most everything we've seen. And then the last type of picture, really the most elaborate of all, is what we're going to call kind of a multivariable plot. When that simply means, as we were talking about before, let's come up with an underlying coordinate system exercise, and then that allows us to map in multiple dimensions of information, data, in a visual way, which might include everything from time to quantity to location to impact, all in one picture that tries to represent a vast summary of knowledge in one visual. So as we go through from increasing order of complexity, those are really the 6 types of pictures that we can draw. So this is path 1, learn to draw and be comfortable. Path 2, learn those 6 separate visual frameworks because they're quite distinct. And each one serves a very specific purpose. And then the third path we could take to help us improve would be, now that we've drawn those pictures, can we learn a simple visual storytelling framework that allows us to then play those pictures back in order to show them to someone else so that they can see our thought process visually represented in exactly the order that we conveyed it, and that's where it becomes the visual story. So Kun Parit, I'd summarize by say, how to get better. Practice drawing. There's lots of ways you can do that. Learn the visual frameworks, and the best way to do that, I have this information available online. I can share with you the URL where people can see my visual frameworks, or they can go through the books that I have out there that describe this. And then the third item is learn to become a better visual storyteller. And that, again, is very prescriptive. There's a very specific way you can learn to do that. How does that sound to you?
So my follow-up question on that is, so can you be a good visual thinker without being good at drawing? And this is a very, very personal question, because a lot of times when I'm at my work, I feel like I'm thinking visually. I feel like I have a visual representation of what my problem is like in my head. But whenever I try to draw that out and communicate to my team, one of the kind of challenges I have is that I'm not able to draw it out or draw what's in my head as accurately on paper. Or at least I think this could be to do with kind of my limited drawing skills as well. But I think I find it very difficult to translate what I'm thinking visually into kind of actual drawings on a piece of paper. So can you actually be a good visual thinker without being good at drawing? Or are you saying that being at least able to draw clearly and drawing kind of simple frameworks is a prerequisite for being a good visual thinker?
Well, again, wow, great question. And the two pieces go in parallel. So if I kind of take from your question, there's actually two questions in there. The first one is, can I be a good visual thinker if I don't know how to draw? And the answer to that is absolutely, because in the drawing that we're talking about, let's be clear, Kun Parit, we're not talking about an artistic process. I don't want you to be able to draw like Leonardo da Vinci did, or that's not important. In fact, it can also be a hindrance in some cases, because some people who are very, very talented at drawing spend so much time elaborating the picture that they're drawing that they kind of lose the bigger picture of what they were trying to achieve. So it's actually, you don't need to have great drawing skills technically to be able to be a good visual thinker, because we're not trying to create an artistic impression. All we're trying to do is clarify what's already in your mind anyway. And invariably, the simpler and clearer your picture is, the better that's probably going to be, even if the drawing is terrible. So that's point number one. Point number two is not so much about whether drawing is what enables us to think, but the real problem about the difficulty of articulating what you see in your mind's eye onto a piece of paper is we have not really been taught how to think very clearly. And this is why I really like these visual frameworks, because what they do is they give you a way to think, hold on a minute. You've got this idea rushing through your mind, and it's got all these moving pieces in it. And we struggle to talk about it, but we really struggle to draw it. So how about we stop for a moment? And let's unpack what we're seeing in our brain by forcing ourselves to draw these 4 or 5 or 6 different pictures of it. And we can do that in about 10 minutes. Take 2 minutes each. Draw me a set of icons that represent who and what you're talking about. Just the first 10 things that come to your mind when I ask you who is involved in your problem and what is involved. Just a customer, a marketer, the CEO, the president, what have you. Just nail them. Take 2 minutes, then stop. Now, take 2 minutes to draw me some charts. What data do you have? And just give me a couple of charts. The point I'm trying to make is, by going through those 4 or 5 or 6 visual frameworks, this is what's so cool and why I get so enthusiastic, Kun Parit. It forces you to use your visual mind to clarify what's already in your head. And the magic isn't the beautiful drawing. The magic is simply trying to come up with a visual way to explain what's already in your head. And if you use these 5 or 6 frameworks that I'm talking about, you will be able to do it. You will clarify what is already in your mind. And it is actually a relief when you go through it, because then at the end you can say, oh, look at what I've done. In 5 pictures, which took me 10 to 15 minutes to draw, I have discovered the essence of my own idea. It's actually a really, really great self-reflection exercise. It's almost like a kind of meditation to clarify the complexity that is always rolling through our head.
So it's not just the output that's important, but kind of the process of arriving at that output can also be important in clarifying your thoughts, right?
Really well said. Yes, I think that's true.
Do you see this skill set becoming more and more important going forward? So if you try to kind of analyze the trends of kind of what type of jobs will be there in 10, 20 years, do you feel that this is a skill set that everyone should learn, everyone should develop, regardless of kind of what professions you are in?
Absolutely I do, and I've seen the evidence for it. And it parallels the rise of big data and the rise of artificial intelligence, the rise of complexity, technological and societal that we have. Let's put it this way. Throughout human history, the problems that people, individuals, and societies have faced have always been complicated, which is why, let's just admit the truth. There have been wars throughout history. There have been territorial disputes. There have been big problems, challenges. The problems that we humans face are really complicated. And guess what? As there are more of us and as technology is increasing, the scale of those problems is only going to increase in complexity. So there's this, again, a kind of an old adage, you've probably heard it. The thinking that got us here is not the thinking that's going to get us to the next step. So one of the reasons I'm such a strong advocate of this visual model as a complement to other, perhaps more well-established types of thinking, is we need to think more synthetically. We need to be able to see the world more in terms of systems and layers and less as linear ABC bullets. Because frankly, the world doesn't work A, B, C, D. That's not how the world actually operates. That's a limitation of language in a way. Us trying to apply the simple sort of sentence structure or grammatical structure of our language, we're trying to apply it, force it on to a really complicated world. And it works. It works up to the point where we can tell a story or think we understand something. But adding on the synthetic ability to see multiple pieces and combine them, which we can only do through pictures, is absolutely imperative as we really try to grapple with the increasingly complex problems that we face. So simple answer, yes.
So I mean, what can businesses do, right, to take advantage of this kind of this tool? So for example, if let's say a business buys into this idea, they truly believe that visual thinking is an essential tool for solving business problems. What can they actually do? So what can a CEO of a certain business actually do to incorporate this kind of thinking into kind of every employee's toolbox?
Yeah, well, there are a couple of tactical answers, and of course, this is a little bit self-serving. I would invite someone to read one of the books that I've written, or any one of my colleagues in the visual thinking world. There are many excellent books out there that just get you thinking about it. I would very strongly advocate that business leaders who appreciate this idea of empowering their teams with this new kind of synthetic, mind-opening toolkit. There are training programs available. In fact, I actually have a business partner in Bangkok who offers my training program, and they've been very successful training up many of the large businesses and organizations in Thailand. So look for training programs. Again, if someone's interested, you can look at danrome.com. That's my website online. So training is valuable because we're not getting this type of training in school yet. So for businesses that want to choose to go this direction, it's really advisable to bring in someone who's been trained on the visual frameworks and start probably not necessarily at the executive level, but probably at the operations level, around sort of the senior manager level within an organization. Employees and teams who have the power to get things done and are listened to by the executives is a great level at which to start, because those levels can report effectively both up and down within the organization. And then the last one, which is more broad, is for anyone who finds what we're talking about inspiring, I strongly encourage you to look for ways to support schools and educational institutions that are adding in visual problem solving into their curriculum, because I think that educators that are seeing value here and are starting to apply this to students, whether it's at a college level or a high school level, should really be supported. And I can tell you, Kun Parit, here in the San Francisco Bay Area where I live, obviously, this is Silicon Valley is here. A lot of the real technological companies that are really pushing the future are headquartered within a few miles of where I'm sitting right now, which means we have a lot of really thoughtful people who are thinking about the future and hopefully thinking about it intelligently, which means that we have a lot of schools here that are willing to try sort of more synthetic, open-minded, open-ended educational processes. So I've been able to share visual thinking in a number of curriculums with schools here in the Bay Area. And so I would encourage people who are interested in building their business out as a better visual thinking organization to actively look as well in recruiting for people who've either been trained or naturally have the ability of sort of synthetic visual communication. I hope that helps.
Yep. And just, I mean, if someone were to want to practice doing this, right? So taking a problem, trying to think visually, trying to map it out into a picture, and then see potential solutions that come up. Should this exercise be done individually, or should it be done in a group setting? What's more productive?
Gosh, a fabulous question. It's interesting because the answer is a hybrid. As you'll notice, many of my answers they're neither black nor white. They're a little bit in the middle. What I have found I've offered my training program thousands of times now, and everywhere from very, very large organizations to small startups to independent schools, where I've been asked to bring these tools into children that are maybe age 12 and with their teachers. And invariably, here's what we find. The exercises you're going to do are individual, but you're doing them in a room of other people that are doing the same thing. So you have the support of being in a room where you can ask a question and be inspired, because often what will happen is we're introducing, it's kind of like a new language. We're introducing a new way of thinking. And, that's tricky. That can be tricky because people haven't done it before. But what's great is we set it up so you have a series of very short exercises that start you out from very, very simple drawing up through then learning each of these frameworks and then applying them. And what we do is we ask people to do it individually, but in a room or at a table with other people that are doing the same thing. And we ask people to create each picture, believe it or not, this is going to sound crazy, in about 2 minutes. We give a very specific instruction. Here's the concept that we want you to explore. Here's the picture we want you to draw, the type of visual framework we want you to use. We start the clock and we give everyone 2 minutes on their own to just draw it on a piece of paper. And then we ask everyone around the table to share it. Because what happens then is you get inspired by the work of other people. And then the second time when you draw your next picture, you've now got all the inputs from everyone around you. So the best way to do it is individually in a group setting. And then if we're doing a more formal workshop or training seminar, by the time we get to the end, then you've got the whole team working together, because now they all share this common language. And one person will say, wait, I'll draw the map. And another person over there will say, okay, I'll draw the timeline. And then this person over here will say, I'll take care of all the icons. And then the fourth person says, okay, I'll draw the charts. and they now know how to do it, and they're sharing back and forth, and each team then collectively is able to create a very beautiful visual story explaining their problem and presenting their proposed solution.
So I think that we're coming towards the end of the episode. So I think just want to kind of finish this episode with a final question. What advice do you have to give to listeners, whether it's business leaders, whether it's individuals who have heard what you shared with us today and feel quite inspired about the importance of visual thinking? What final words or pieces of advice do you have for them here?
Oh, thank you for letting me share this. So yes, the next time you face a problem or a challenge, or you don't know what to do and you're thinking it through, the simple advice is this: take a sheet of paper, not a computer. Leave your computer out of this. Just grab a plain old piece of paper or a notebook and a pencil or a pen and draw a circle on your piece of paper. And whatever you're thinking about your problem, whatever is the first thing that comes to mind, label that circle, and it will usually be me because we tend to see ourselves at the center of every problem that exists. So draw a little circle and label it me or my problem, and then draw another circle next to that and label it whatever is the next thing that comes to mind. And in this case, it might be you. The problem begins with me and then it goes to you. And then the third circle, and what would that be? And it would be, oh, we're running out of time. And then the fourth circle. And within a few moments, if you just kind of let your hand continue, don't edit, it's that creation, that mind map that we were starting out with from the beginning. But in this case, what will happen is after a few minutes, I guarantee you will begin to see things emerging that you didn't even know you were thinking about. And that's when the real problem solving begins. And it's as simple as that.
Well, thank you very much, Dan, for sharing your thoughts with us today. I think hopefully all the listeners will agree with me that when we see the world becoming more and more complex, I think we see the importance of being able to think more clearly visually, being able to structure your problem more visually in order to find solutions that you never thought you could find. So thank you for sharing with us some tips and tricks on that today. Also, for anyone out there who's been listening to this podcast, if you've had a go at visualizing this conversation, please do send in your visual representation of this conversation. It'll be interesting to hear and see what you guys make of this. And if you want to also listen in to other great conversations with other business leaders and business experts, please do tune into our podcast every Wednesday. It's called In the Name of Work with me, your host, Parit Wacharasindhu. Thank you very much, Dan, for joining us today.
Khap khun mak khap. I really enjoyed it.